Hello, everybody. Welcome to another little story about the Niagara region, and we'll cover General Brock and the history that unfolded at that time around here. Now, I've never known anything about General Brock, but we did drive by his monument several times, as it was right at the border as you go over Queenston Bridge into the United States. But we never really paid much attention to it. Now, Isaac Brock was born in October the 6th, 1769 in Guernsey, which at that time belonged to the British. He came to Canada in 1802, probably with the military, because the British had some problems with the Americans who didn't really want anything to do anymore with the British, and the French was giving them a hard time as well. So anyway, in 1812, he organized a militia and some native troops, and they sailed all the way down Lake Erie to Detroit and retook the city. Well, I suppose it was the city at the time, from the Americans, even though the Americans had more men, but I guess it was a smart strategy and whatever it took to retake Detroit. Now the American retreated back to the Niagara frontier, where they reorganized, and Brock quickly hurried over to the Queenston Heights, and there was a big battle that ensued, and unfortunately General Brock was severely injured, and he succumbed to his injuries on the battlefield. As you can imagine, this was not for the faint of heart, and pretty brutal being in that battle. Now, how do we get here? Well, obviously, we had the natives that had been living here for a long, long time, but in 1647, the neutrals who lived in this area at the time were invaded by the Seneca, who lived on the east side of the Niagara River, which is today's New York State. And then, of course, there was also an epidemic, and a lot of people died, and unfortunately, the neutral basically were wiped out. So there were some other natives that took over the area, but what really happened then was in the 1780s, the Loyalists started moving in the area because they didn't like being in the American side, so they established themselves more or less in the Niagara Lake area and the Upper Canada, and so the main area was Kingston, Bay of Quinte, and Niagara Peninsula. And also there was some settling actually near Detroit, but it actually was on the east side of the Detroit River. I think it was Amherstburg. It was a fairly big settlement. And there was also later on, a lot of the slaves ended up settling in that area when they escaped the United States. But there was very generous land grants for the people who came here. The 100 acres, and then if you had additional family members, another 50 acres. And if you were in field officer, you got 1,000 acre. And on top of that, you got clothing, tools, and provisions, sort of supply for 3 years. But, I know it looks pretty generous, but at that time, Niagara region was more or less just all forested. So you'd have to go and clear the forest if you wanted to have productive land for farming. So a lot of the loyalists that came here to Upper Canada were mostly American frontiersmen who wanted to take advantage of the generous land grants. So in 1790 in Quebec, they already had a population of about 10,000 people. So on this map, you can see the area that's green is what they call Lower Canada. Today it's Quebec and some of the maritime provinces. And Upper Canada is what we today call Ontario, and it's mostly around the Great Lake region. So when Upper Canada was established, and this is the Chateau in Quebec City, beautiful building. But what I didn't realize was also the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, they received a preferential treatment, and they were given a lot of land and for the support and maintenance of a Protestant clergy. And as you can see, that probably ended up being sold and divvied up to the religious supporters. Here you can see a swath of where the loyalists migrated to. And I noticed also up along the Hudson River, there was a large area where the loyalists also moved to. And of course then around South Shore Lake Ontario. But then in 1812, the American government declared war with the British, and I couldn't quite understand how Isaac Brock got involved in that letter there. So then the war 1812 was actually, it started 1812, there was when the war was declared, but ended up being, I guess it was finally done in 1814. It was probably a 3-year war, because I think there was still some battles going on in 1815. But you can see where all the settlements were. And now we're going to look a little closer into the area along the Niagara River where some of the activity happened. This is Fort George. It's down by Niagara on the Lake, and this, of course, is the rebuilt version, because the original version got overrun by the Americans in a battle, and also they got destroyed and burned. Now Niagara, the Fort George is at the mouth of the Niagara River, and across the river is Fort Niagara, which was the American built that to protect their area. And the fort actually sits back probably about 500 feet from the river itself. So you can see that this area was where when they attacked the fort, the Americans had to basically an uphill battle from the river to take the fort. And you can see that it's fairly large because they had a lot of areas where they could do their military exercises and practices. And this is the buildings where the troops had their housing, and the officers, they had separate buildings. And then of course there was the kitchens and all, they were separate again, because when they were cooking they didn't want to take a chance of fires. As you can see, the troops had their rather basic utensils, metal bowls and plates, cups, and I wouldn't be surprised when they were moving on, everybody had to bring their own bowl. And you can see the officers, they had rather fancier table set dishes, and I'm sure their food was probably slightly better than what the soldiers had. And in this rack you see the rifles that were used around 1812, and those rifles actually the British made in London, and they were also, even in India, they all used the same rifles. And when the soldiers were training, one of the objectives was that you should be able to shoot 4 shots in a minute, but that was sort of what was required, but apparently it was very difficult to be that fast, because you basically had to, put the gunpowder in. Well, they had the little cartridge, almost like cartridge, little bags where they put it in and put your bullet in, and so it's not like today. But there was basically 3 components to those rifles, and one was the barrel, and then it was the stock, and then the lock was what they referred to, where the actual mechanism is to shoot. So in order to put it all together, they had it manufactured with different companies, and so basically they needed lock, stock, and barrel to be able to accomplish it all. But they also had big guns, and they had slots in the fence, and you can see now they was pointed towards the river, because that's where they assumed that the attacks were going to come from. And I'm sure they were a lot more powerful. And they also had slots cut out in the fence around the fort, where they could shoot out and be still protected. Only trouble was everything was out of wood, so once the thing started burning, it was game over pretty quick. We can also see a lot of the buildings were out of wood, because that's what was available in the area at the time. But look at the beautiful miter joints they made in the corner. It was fantastic woodwork. And this is a painting from that era, and you see across the river is the Fort Niagara on the other side, and this is how it looks today, a little more up to date. And nice gazebo. And it seems to me that the buildings haven't changed much over the couple of 100 years. I mean, I know that the Canadian side they ended up. But anyway, it was all quiet in 1812, looking across, didn't see anything. And but they knew something was happening soon. And there you have it now. Bad news is starting. The Americans are starting to invade. And I guess you have to come back to see the second part and see how it all unfolded.